Hello and welcome to day 18 of the TooFatLardies Advent Calendar for 2024. I do hope that your Christmas preparations are proceeding to plan and that the Christmas parties that you have inevitably been attending have been full of Christmas cheer. I know that the one we had at TooFatLardies certainly was, because I can still feel my head banging and memories of it keep slipping back into my mind. However, it falls to me to open window 18 on the calendar. So without further ado, let's open the calendar and see what it says. Hello, Nick. Figure it out. If you could influence future designs for figures, what changes would you suggest that you think would improve the miniatures we have on our table? Figure design is always something that's fascinated me, although I've never really understood exactly the full process that a figure needs to go through to get from an idea to a figure that I can actually buy. The whole process is still very much a mystery to me. We did have a really interesting chat with a guest on the Oddcast this year when we were very lucky to be able to talk to the extremely talented Mr. Paul Hicks and to learn a bit more from him about the figure sculpting process. And Paul's very keen to stress how he uses real-life models as much as he can to get his ideas. He likes to take photos of reenactors, for instance, to just see what real poses look like. And I do wish that all other sculptors would prove to me that they've gone through the same process, because sometimes I just don't think they have. And I guess that's certainly true with many of the cartoony figures that we see on the War Games tables of today, and many of the 3D print designs which are still coming through at that level. To be fair, I know there are historically, realistically proportioned 3D prints too. I'm not going to talk too much about 3D and plastic and metal, because I think we talk a lot about that. But I don't actually have a problem with cartoony figures. I think they're quite good fun. I do enjoy painting them. I think their facial details can be quite nice, even if a little grotesque and oversized. And I know this is something that does divide listeners and even divides opinion around the table at TooFatLardies. There is a time and a place for cartoony. Paul Hicks's figures are famously proportioned as for real humans, whereas other figures have a kind of misshapenness in them, in the sense that if you were to blow them up to full size, you'd see some of the most grotesque and ridiculous proportions. We'd see people with massive hands, with huge heads, with noses the size of Christmas puddings. And although that might be what I see when I go to visit my in-laws, it isn't necessarily what I expect to see in most modern societies. Thankfully, although what fun it would be if we were all proportioned exactly like that. One of the issues, of course, with overemphasizing certain proportions is that you then end up overemphasizing everything else that goes around it, which means that big hands end up holding massive revolvers and big noses create big helmets and headgear. So now my mind goes back to the good old days and to the old Airfix figures of my youth, and I think of some of the poses that we used to get in those boxes. Yes, there was normally a really solid pose of a soldier standing and firing. Yes, there was normally a soldier kneeling and firing. And that was certainly true in the Napoleonics. It was also true in the cowboy set. It was true in the First World War set. It was true in the Second World War sets. And thankfully, these suitable poses were generally the norm. It's probably also why they were so popular. There was a certain realism about the poses in the box. There was normally an officer or an obvious leader. And of course, commonly, these leaders were positioned and posed with their arms gesturing. I'm thinking about the famous Australian Airfix figure, the leader with the machete in one hand and the pistol waving above his head, or the German Afrika Korps officer holding his binoculars whilst waving his hand above his head, and the British paratrooper from the Airfix sets holding his binoculars on his chest whilst pointing the direction for the advance. Leaders need to be identifiable on our War Games tables, and having them in these exaggerated poses always helps us with this. I actually do like my officer and leader figures to be visible as such, So if an officer is beckoning men forward or pointing, that's always an indicator of a leader figure. And that makes sense. They all make perfect sense. But when I look back to those old plastic figures, not every pose made sense. There was always at least one figure in every box that completely looked out of place. I'm thinking about the classic figure holding the rifle above his head whilst trying to bayonet somebody on the floor or somebody laying in a bunk bed. It was one of those figures that never really fitted in my collection, and wherever I put this figure on the table, it always looked ridiculous. I remember there was a French Napoleonic figure who was standing on one leg, who looked like he was trying to use his musket to poke out the ceiling tiles in a modern-day office. It very much gave me the reminder of somebody with a broom handle trying to take the cobwebs out of the corner of the room. And some of those poses were just weird. There was a British paratrooper, I remember, in the HO00 set. And to be fair, most of the British paratroopers in the HO00 set were completely weird. Quite why they weren't the same scaled down versions of the 1/32 set, I'll never really quite know. But anyway, there was a figure there who was standing with his feet together, holding his machine gun above his head, who looked like he was machine gunning somebody off through a lift hatch or a loft hatch. In the American paratrooper set, I remember there was a guy who looked like he was disco dancing. What was a 10-year-old supposed to do with a 20mm disco dancer wearing full camo? These figures are kind of useless. So when you're trying to do something with them that looks practical, they're crazy. And I think some of that practice in figure design still remains today. There's always one figure in a pack that lets the side down. Why do we have to have figures running with one leg in the air? Not just in the air, but crazily in the air, like they're trying to run the steeplechase. I just don't like some of those running figures, because especially where that single remaining foot then becomes obviously the only point of contact on the base. Because I know that what will happen when I put that figure in the hands of the great sausage-fingered wargamer that I'm fated to play most of my games with, is that figure will inevitably come off the base within 10 seconds. So we need figures to have a really good point of contact with the base. It makes them more durable, makes them more portable. But if I could influence figure design, what would I really go for? I think that actually, in the horse and musket era, we've generally got it quite right for figure designs. We have, in that instance, a nice range of figures who go well together to create a block of infantry. We will have figures with shouldered arms or advancing, and I think that they look right together. There are now ranges where not all figures are the same, and there is a bit of variety that just gives the unit that realistic look. I think when we come to other periods, I'm not quite sure we've got it quite so locked down. I think medievals are quite good. I am building up slowly a collection of Baron's War figures, and I do enjoy the poses. The action poses are good, although sometimes I'd rather see a knight standing at rest rather than running about waving his mace in the air. Perhaps he's something to do with that old US paratrooper disco dancer. But when we get to the period for which I have the most figures, the Second World War, I think there's more we can do. And I think by extension, there probably is more we can do in some other periods too. I think machine gun teams in the Second World War are an issue. It's true that most light machine guns were deployed and fired from the prone position, but then many other troops also did their firing from the prone position too. And yet our machine gun teams are often only available in packs that include prone figures. The thing with prone figures is they look okay in the right situation, but they don't look okay when they're not in that situation, like when they're advancing or moving, which is often the way we want to see our figures. So I'd like to see more light machine gun teams on the move. The other thing I don't like to see in my light machine guns is people firing them from the hip. So we either get figures that are prone or guys that are firing from the hip. Now, I know we all love our Commando comics, and nobody likes them more than me, but really, that's not the way these machine guns were fired. I'd rather see them being carried, just as if they'd been ported to a new position. So I'd like to also see more figures carrying the supporting ammunition for the weapon too. More obvious weapon crews. I'd like to see more Germans with ammunition belts, for instance. Yes, I know the belts would be put by the machine gunner when he was in action, but I'd like to see more of the obvious evidence of a unit carrying the stuff that it actually needs. One of the things I think was great about Paul Hicks's Item Kickstarter that Empress Miniatures have run this year was the inclusion of the hand carts, the little hand carts that airborne units used to carry kit around with. And it's these figures that give a sense of reality to what we have on the table. They make great vignettes, which everybody loves. So if I were to desire more from my figure manufacturers and from my figure designers, I'd like more figures who are in what you might call the support role. What I mean by that is that I'd like to see more medics. I'd like to see more wounded figures being treated by medics. I'd like to see more casualty figures so that we can track the trail of the action across the tabletop. I'd like to see more engineers with communication cable reels or with ammunition boxes. I'd like to see people carrying the hardware of war. I'd like to see engineers with tools building bridges. I think one of the things that really makes a difference to our vignettes is these kind of figures that we can bring realistic situations to the tabletop. It makes a massive difference. I remember being at Partisan show earlier this year, and First Corps had a beautiful table set up. Now, I can't remember now if it was the US-Mexican War or if it was the American Civil War, but the vignettes were just wonderful. There were soldiers seated around a campfire, officers taking messages or writing orders, maybe at a table, maybe on their horses, taking a message, that kind of thing. The vignettes are crucially important in bringing a table to life. And for me, they also serve to break up the painting process. If I'm painting 40 figures, I like to have a little reward every 10 figures or so by painting a figure that's a bit different, by painting a figure who will be part of a vignette or who will be part of a jump-off point or support option rather than a full platoon member. It might be a guy with a pack mule or unloading an ammo carrier. He might be taking a drink from a flask or just generally doing the kind of things that people do and not just running about on one leg with a bayonet and rifle high in the air trying to brush the cobwebs out the corner of the room. So that's why I would like to see more of the associated paraphernalia, some of the support troops that are such an essential part in supporting the sharp end of any action. Oh, and detachable heads. Give us more detachable heads so that we can have more variety. So, figure designers, if you're out there sipping a glass of mulled wine and planning your next range, please consider this as a Dear Santa letter. Dear Santa, figure designer, I've been a very good boy all year. Please, can we have more support troops, more engineers, more auxiliaries, more messengers, more radio operators, more wounded figures, more people unloading trucks, more people carrying ammunition boxes, more people taking a drink from a flask, more people helping a wounded colleague, more officers writing messages, and even figures who are surrendering or who are casualties or who portray the dead of our miniature battles. I will leave a mince pie and a glass of single malt whiskey out for you. And if you could leave some of those under my tree this year, then I would be a very happy bunny indeed. Yours, Nicholas, aged 56 3/4.